Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to continue our coverage of the 2019 Grand Prix, the second tournament. This one's being held in Latvia. We are in round one, 3 days in, still in round one. That is because we are on tiebreakers. This is a knockout tournament, 16 competitors going head-to-head in a best-of-2 series, and you would expect with chess high level with 16 players, especially in round one, there are some tiebreakers. Our competitors today, white's going to be played by Topalov, currently the 18th ranked player in the world, but he's been around for a long time. He was the world champion 14 years ago, looking to get his chance to get back on top. Maybe you can parlay this into the candidates tournament. He did not play in the first tournament in the Grand Prix, so we will be playing this one as well as one in November and December. His opponent playing the black pieces is the American Nakamura, currently the 15th ranked player in the world. He did play in the first tournament. He reached to the semifinals, looking to improve on that in this tournament. Now, in the first set of the tiebreakers, they do play 2 games. Those are 25-minute, and then they get a 10-second increment after each move, compared to the normal essentially 2 hours. You get 90 minutes and then you get 30 minutes after move 40. So essentially 2 hours plus 30 seconds. So it's much faster. They play a best of 2 series. And then if no one wins, they go to even faster time controls. So we'll go ahead and get into it with Topalov playing the white pieces. He starts out with e4. e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and then knight to f6. So getting into the Berlin defense, we've seen this very frequently over the past few years. And then we see Topalov play d3. This is pretty common. We also see castle on the king side, so it really doesn't shock me at all, just because this is extremely common at high level play. Bishop down here, c5, a pawn c3, getting ready to push if he wants to on d4, trying to control the center of the board right here. Castle on the king side, bishop g5, pinning down this knight to the queen. Pawn to h6, forcing the bishop to come back here. Bishop to e7, and then castle on the king side. Pawn to d6, just solidifying the pawn chain, opening up the door for the light square bishop here. And then the bishop comes back here to g3. Didn't have to come back right away. You don't really expect your opponent to be pushing down here to g5, which would really force that. But decides to want to just bring it back here. He's not really doing too much here on h4. And just doesn't want to have to deal with this knight at some point moving. And then he has his bishop exposed by this bishop here on e7. Pawn to a6, forcing the bishop to come back here to a4. Pawn at b5, and then the bishop retreats back here to c2. And usually you see this when the knight's here on c6, because bishop b3, knight to a5. Okay, now the bishop is just going to come back here to c2. And if you don't want your opponent to have the knight here on a5, because maybe later on he wants to come to c4, if you do try to push forward here on d4, may not be what you're looking to. So instead, as Topalov does, as many players will do, they just brought their bishop here to c2. Nakamura continues with rook to e8, just centralizing that a little bit more. Knight to d2, and Topalov has completed his development here. Bishop to f8, just opening up for this rook here on e8 to control a little bit more of the center of the board, since it's not being blocked anymore. Rook here to e1, same thing on white side, trying to control the center with his rooks here. Knight to h5, attacking the bishop. No real way to really defend against this. Decides to bring his knight down here to f1. After the exchange, if you're just watching these games for those following along, it almost looked like as soon as he played this knight here to f1 that he was immediately just going to take here on g3. He had other options, and he decided to use those options and took here with his pawn on g3, really opening up for his knight to come to e3. Doesn't make a lot of sense to bring it here to h2. That's not what the game is about, but does want to centralize his knight. He does have a nice little outpost here on f5 as well as d5. So those are some of the options that he is looking at. Pawn here to g6. This does stop one of the outposts that the knight could eventually come to on f5. But this is also a little tricky. This is just pushing a little more air in front of Nakamura's king here. So while is it a good move, definitely just something to keep in mind as Nakamura's may have to defend a little bit more than he wants to in front of his king. Knight to e3 as expected. Bishop to g7, just fianchettoing this bishop here, trying to attack the center of the board, putting a lot of his defenses. His knight here on c6, bishop here to g7, rook here on e8, really trying to make sure he holds on to this e5 square. We talked about earlier the pawn could push forward here to d4, so white can at any time push forward. Black wants to make sure that he is prepared for that push. Now white moves pawn a4 and then rook over here to b8, and that's much better than the pawn taking. You always want to look at what your opponent's going to do, how they're going to take back, and then what did they have. If the pawn takes, then the bishop's going to recapture here. This rook here on a1 is automatically activated, has a semi-open file, and now he's stuck either defending with his rook here on a8 or his bishop here on c8. Neither of those is what he wants to be doing, and now there's a very aggressive bishop here on a4, pinning down the knight. There's no other pawns that he can really use to support this knight. So either he's going to have to put his rook on a really awkward square, or he's going to end up losing this knight right here and still have to worry about defending this pawn. So definitely would be a really terrible move if he took with his pawn. He does not, but just something to keep in mind as you're playing in your own games. Brought his rook here to b8. After the exchange, we see the pawn take here. Now there's an open file here. Doesn't have to worry about the rook attacking the square right here. So definitely a good way to go about it. And you do want to be taking with your pawn. You don't want to take with your rook. Things get really tricky here. Bishop to a4. As we said before, it's pinning down material here. So now it's pinning down the rook to the knight here. So maybe, okay, let's bring the rook to b6. That seems good in theory, but unfortunately after knight to c4, this is going to remove that rook, and then the knight's just going to be hanging out right here. So that's going to be an awful way to exchange. So we do see Nakamura correctly take with his pawn here on b5. Bishop to b3, just now attacking this long diagonal right here. Also, this pawn is being pinned down, so if he ever wanted to push forward, he does have to keep that in mind because his king is just going to be hanging out right here. That is one of the things that black always has to keep in mind if he plays this pawn up here to a5 and then wants to support it with this pawn chain like this, is the light square bishop does have free reign to control these light squares. Rook back to f8, wants to make sure he holds on to that material right here. And as soon as the rook moves away from defending the pawn here on e5, immediately we see Topalov come in here and play pawn to d4. Always want to be looking at what your opponent's giving up when they move. They may be moving for a good reason now to defend this square, but that does also open up an opportunity, and so he immediately pushes for that opportunity. Now pawn to b4 says, hey, if you want to go ahead and start chipping away in the center, I'm going to start chipping away at your pawn chain as well. This pawn over here is kind of hanging out by himself. The knight here on c6 really needs to move before the pawn can support it, and the knight really needs to hang out here to hang on to this pawn on e5. So this pawn completely okay if it does leave by the wayside. Bishop to d5, just centralizing, now attacking the knight. Says, you got to make a move here. What are you going to do? Bishop to d7 says, yeah, I'll go ahead and protect that. Rook to a6, so just adding more and more pressure, really putting a lot of pressure on Nakamura. Again, these are much quicker paced games, so many times if you can just put a lot of pressure on your opponent, eventually they will make a mistake or just may not make the optimal play at any given time. Knight to e7, pawn takes on e5. We knew eventually that would happen. Now that the knight moves here to e7, that's the exact spot that white decided to go and push forward. You can sense that building since the very beginning of the game. Pawn takes back on e5, and then the bishop comes to c4. Pawn takes here, pawn recapture, so there is an isolated pawn for both sides here on the c file, but this bishop still eyeing down, pinning down this pawn here on f7. Also something to keep in mind that this rook can come over here to g6. Now it is defended by the knight on e7, but the pawn cannot recapture. So at any time if this knight were to move, then the rook can easily swing it over and take here on a g6 freely. Why is that? Because the pawn cannot recapture because of the bishop eyeing down, pinning down that to the king. So always be looking at, okay, knowing that really that knight's there, so that knight's stuck. Wants to come to another square, but really just cannot. Nakamura, realizing this, plays bishop to c6, blocking off the rook from attacking. Also just centralizing the bishop, attacking the pawn here on e4, which does not have pawn support right now, and it is defended by the knight here on e7. Definitely want to be defending your minor pieces more than your king side over here that does have some weakness. Queen to c2. This does protect the pawn since it doesn't have a lot of good ways to do that. Rook to a8. Rook over here to a1, we do see an exchange. Similar setup as before, but we do see two rooks come off the board. And then king to h7. Just wants to make sure that his king's no longer being pinned down by the bishop. Does give him some other options if he wants to start pushing forward on the king side. Rook to a5 now wants to start attacking the center of the board. He does have his knight and his rook both attacking it. Pawn to f6, as we discussed, freely to do that now that the king's here on h7, so adds an extra layer of support. Knight to d2, queen to d7, a knight to b3, so starting to move over to the queen side of the board. Rook to a8, a knight up here to c5, attacking the queen, says, yeah, you can take my rook if you want to. Queen to d6, there is an exchange on the board. Knight to e6, so really nice square here for the knight to be attack so many of the squares from Nakamura's side, and then the bishop here protecting that. Pawn to h5, and then queen down here to b1. If you're looking at it and figure, why doesn't he take that bishop? His opponent has a bishop pair. Isn't that a good thing? Generally, yes. And at the beginning of the game, a bishop pair is usually stronger than any other minor piece combination. But once you start getting into the endgame, you have to look at where the pawns are on the board. And for the most part, the pawns are on one side of the board. This C file here with two isolated pawns, it's still pretty close. And if it's just one side of the board where pawns are at, knights actually tend to do better because they can control so much of the board. If there's pawn chains on both sides, bishop tends to do better because they can get to both sides of the board much easier. So in this case, Topalov, he has the knight advantage because he has the doubled knights. So I would give a slight edge to white here in this position. Queen to b6, we do see an exchange right here, and then bishop d5. And this is a really interesting spot right here. Lots of games have interesting setups where if you're analyzing, trying to figure out, which side you would take in this position. But really nice move from Topalov, and just pause if you want to, but curious where people would go if they were black. And the reason I think this is interesting is a lot of beginners, they don't always think about how another side's going to recapture, and because of that they end up in a really tough spot because it seems pretty reasonable that Topalov has a good setup here, so why not just start exchanging down? Especially if you're Nakamura, he's better at faster chess, so if we can just draw this game, we go to faster chess, he probably is going to have a better shot here. But if he decides to take, he's going to be in a world of hurt. The main reason for that is he's going to recapture with his pawn, and he's going to have a passed pawn. And that is absolutely not what you want to happen here. There's just no way to really stop this. He can't recapture. The knight is protecting that. So maybe get his king involved into the game. But the pawn's just going to start pushing forward. Again, continue to push forward. If the king does come over here, I can just go ahead and queen up here on d8. Yes, the knight can take it here, but after the knight takes on d8, white's just up too much material. If we come back and say, what if the bishop doesn't take it? What if the knight takes it? Going to be similar. Pawn takes here on d5. The bishop cannot take here. There's just no real way to stop this. If the bishop comes to b7, you can start to attack it with your knight here. Knight up to c4, now threatening this material right here. There's just no good way to stop the pawn from pushing forward. So Nakamura, realizing this, plays correctly and responds with bishop to c6. The bishop takes here. The knight's going to recapture. Knight up here to d5, attacking the pawn. Pawn down to b5, king to f1. Now that the queens are off the board, we do start to see the kings get more and more involved. Now Nakamura starts to push on the king side. f5. king here to e2, bishop h6, a knight to c7, attacking the pawn. Knight over here to a7, defending it. While this is a good square to defend it, this is not where you want your knight. You can see that Topalov has two very active knights, and Nakamura over here is just forced to hang out on the a file all by himself, just defending this pawn. Not at all, not looking all that great for Nakamura right here. The pawn takes on f5, knight to e7. He can just hang out over here, wait for his opponent to make a mistake, because he can just centralize those knights very, very quickly. Pawn to f4, we do see an exchange right here. King to f3, stopping the pawn. Pawn can't go anywhere. The bishop can't go too many good squares. And then we see an extremely surprising move. Something that I would imagine most people are not going to expect, and that is Nakamura just giving up his knight. And as soon as Topalov retook the knight, and my guess is there were some confused faces, Nakamura decided to go ahead and resign. Now, first time you look at it, you may think that the pawn's going to recapture here on c6. Black's going the other way. That was just Nakamura. I'm not sure if he didn't see the knight, exactly why, but he just moved and gave up his knight. And because of that, he is now out of the tournament. So Topalov takes that game, and after they drew the first one in the tiebreaker. So Topalov will be moving on. Nakamura, he is not. So not exactly what he was looking for. It is going to be very, very difficult for him now to be in the top two of the entire Grand Prix. Got in the semifinals. He really needs a lot of things to go his way, but not looking good right now. But congratulations, Topalov. Played a fantastic game. Knowing they didn't play in the first tournament in the Grand Prix, now he wins round one against a very strong opponent, Nakamura, especially in a fast chess, which Nakamura is always going to be better at than Topalov. This was a massive win for him. So thank you guys so much for watching. This concludes round one. Tomorrow we do start round number 2. We'll get back into classical chess as far as the timing controls, and we'll see who comes out of the final 8 competitors.